The crying started at exactly 3:17 a.m. I know because I checked my phone when the sound first woke me. It was faint, barely audible through my bedroom window, but unmistakably the sound of a child in distress. I tried to ignore it, pulling my pillow over my head and telling myself it was probably just a cat or some other animal. But deep down, I knew what I was hearing. A child was crying somewhere in the darkness outside my house. My house sits on the edge of town, with nothing but an old cemetery separating me from miles of dense forest. It's usually peaceful here, almost too quiet most nights. That's why the crying stood out so starkly against the silence. After 10 minutes of tossing and turning, I finally gave in and got up. I pulled on a sweatshirt and jeans, grabbed my flashlight and headed downstairs. Standing on my front porch, the crying became clearer. It was definitely coming from the direction of the cemetery. What kind of parent would let their child wander near a graveyard at this hour? Or worse, what if the child was lost or abandoned? I couldn't just go back to bed, knowing a kid might be in trouble. The iron gates of the cemetery were always left unlocked, a fact that had bothered me since I moved here 2 years ago. As I pushed one open, the hinges groaned in protest, momentarily drowning out the soft weeping. My flashlight beam cut through the fog that had settled among the headstones, creating eerie, shifting shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The crying grew louder as I ventured deeper into the cemetery. It seemed to be coming from behind a large mausoleum near the back fence. I called out, hoping to reassure whoever was there.
Hello? Is someone there? It's okay. I'm here to help.
The crying stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was somehow more unnerving than the weeping had been. I rounded the corner of the mausoleum, my flashlight beam landing on a small figure huddled against a headstone. It was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing what looked like a white nightgown. Her head was bowed, dark hair obscuring her face.
Hey there, are you okay? Are you lost?
She didn't respond or look up. I approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her further.
My name's, well, that doesn't matter. I live in that house just outside the cemetery. I heard you crying. Can I help you find your parents?
Still no response. I was about 10 feet away now, close enough to see that her nightgown was dirty and torn in places. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't just leave a child alone in a cemetery in the middle of the night.
I'm going to come a little closer, okay? I won't hurt you, I just want to help.
As I took another step forward, an old man's voice called out from behind me, startling me so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight.
Stop right there. Don't go any closer to her.
I spun around to see an elderly man hurrying toward me as fast as his frail legs would carry him. He was wearing a security guard uniform that hung loosely on his thin frame. I hadn't even known the cemetery had security.
It's okay. There's a lost child here. She needs help.
That's no child. Step away from it, now.
The old man's face was deadly serious, his eyes wide with what looked like genuine fear. He grabbed my arm with surprising strength and tried to pull me back.
What are you talking about? She's right there.
Listen to me, son. I've worked this cemetery for 43 years. That thing shows up every few years. Always the same little girl, always crying, always waiting for someone to approach her.
I looked back at the girl, who still hadn't moved or acknowledged our presence. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air.
What do you mean, that thing?
3 people have disappeared in this cemetery during my time here. All of them reported hearing a child crying before they vanished. The last one was a young mother about 12 years ago. They only found one of her shoes, right where you're standing now.
I involuntarily stepped back, looking down at the ground beneath my feet. When I looked up again, the girl had raised her head slightly, though her face was still hidden by her hair.
Don't look at it, don't speak to it, just back away. Slowly.
I wanted to believe the old man was crazy, that he was confused or suffering from dementia. But something in his voice, the absolute certainty and terror, made me hesitate. And then the girl spoke, her voice unnaturally sweet and clear in the foggy night air.
Please don't leave me. I'm so scared. Can you help me find my mommy?
Her voice didn't sound like a child's voice should. It was too perfect, too rehearsed, like an adult imitating a child. The security guard's grip on my arm tightened.
Don't answer it. Whatever you do, don't answer.
The girl slowly began to stand up, still keeping her face hidden.
Please, mister. I'm cold and scared. Can you come closer? I can't see you very well.
Her movements were wrong somehow, too fluid, too controlled for a child. I found myself backing away without consciously deciding to do so.
We need to leave, now.
We turned and began walking quickly toward the cemetery gates. I could hear soft footsteps behind us, following at a measured pace.
Why are you leaving me? Don't you want to help me?
Her voice had changed, becoming deeper, with an edge that made my skin crawl. The security guard and I quickened our pace, nearly jogging now.
Everyone leaves me. No one stays. But you will stay. You have to stay.
We were almost at the gates when I made the mistake of looking back. The girl was following us, but she wasn't walking anymore. Her feet were hovering several inches above the ground, her nightgown billowing around her as if underwater, and her face, what I could see of it through her hair, was wrong. The proportions were distorted, the features twisted into something that only approximated a human face. We broke into a run, bursting through the gates and not stopping until we reached my front porch. The security guard was wheezing, clutching his chest as he struggled to catch his breath. I looked back at the cemetery, but there was no sign of the girl.
What the hell was that thing?
We don't know. Nobody knows. Some say it's the spirit of a child who was buried here without proper rites. Others think it's something that was never human to begin with, just wearing the shape of a child to lure people in.
I invited the old man inside, and he gratefully accepted. As I made us both strong coffee, he told me more about the cemetery and its history. Apparently, the crying child had been appearing for generations, long before he started working there.
My grandfather was the caretaker before me. He warned me about it when I took the job. Said his father had warned him too. It's always the same. The crying, the little girl in white, the people who disappear.
Why doesn't anyone do anything about it? Close the cemetery at night, put up warnings?
Who would believe it? The town council thinks it's just stories. And the thing is clever. It never takes more than one person every decade or so, just enough to become a local legend, not enough to cause a real investigation.
We sat in silence for a while, the reality of what we'd encountered sinking in. Around 5 a.m. as the sky began to lighten, the security guard said he needed to get back to his post. I walked him to the door.
Remember what I told you. If you ever hear a child crying near the cemetery again, ignore it. Lock your doors, close your windows, and wait for morning. Promise me.
I promise.
I watched him walk back toward the cemetery, his stooped figure gradually disappearing into the morning mist. I was exhausted, but knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. Instead, I made another cup of coffee and sat on my porch, watching the sun rise over the cemetery. 3 days passed without incident. I began to wonder if I had overreacted, if perhaps there had been a real lost child, and the security guard's superstitions had prevented us from helping her. The thought gnawed at me, making me question what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. On the fourth night, I was awakened by a knock at my front door. I checked the time, 3:17 a.m. exactly, the same time I'd heard the crying. I lay perfectly still, hoping whoever it was would go away. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Against my better judgment, I crept downstairs and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. I was about to return to bed when a small voice called from the other side of the door.
I know you're in there. I saw you looking at me. Please let me in. It's cold out here.
My blood turned to ice. I backed away from the door, remembering the security guard's warning.
I just want to come inside where it's warm. Don't you want to help me? Everyone wants to help a crying child.
The voice was changing again, becoming less childlike with each word. I remained silent, backing further into my living room.
I know you can hear me. I followed you home that night. I know where you live now. I know where you sleep.
Something scraped against the door. Not like knocking, but like fingernails, dragging slowly down the wood.
Let me in, let me in, let me in.
The last 3 words were spoken in a deep, guttural voice that couldn't possibly have come from a child. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The scraping at the door stopped, and for a moment I thought whatever was out there had given up. Then I heard it, soft footsteps circling my house, followed by the sound of tapping on each window as it passed. I huddled in the center of my living room, as far from the windows as possible. The tapping continued for what felt like hours, moving from window to window in a methodical pattern. Eventually the sky began to lighten, and the tapping stopped. When the sun was fully up, I cautiously approached one of the windows and looked out. There was no one there, but something had been drawn in the dirt of my front yard. A crude stick figure of a man, with X's for eyes. I called in sick to work and drove into town, determined to find the security guard and get more information. When I reached the cemetery office, a young woman was behind the desk.
Can I help you?
I'm looking for the night security guard, older gentleman, probably in his 70s.
We don't have a night security guard. The cemetery closes at dusk.
My stomach dropped.
But I met him just a few nights ago. He was wearing a uniform.
Sir, this cemetery hasn't had security staff for over 15 years. Budget cuts. Are you sure you're thinking of the right place?
I described the old man in detail, but she just shook her head, looking increasingly concerned about my mental state. As a last resort, I asked about the history of disappearances in the cemetery.
Well, there was a woman who went missing about 12 years ago. They found one of her shoes in the cemetery, but that's it. And back in the 90s, a teenage boy disappeared after telling his friends he was going to spend the night in the cemetery on a dare. But those are just coincidences.
I wasn't so sure. I thanked her and left, more confused than ever. Who was the old man I'd met? Had he been trying to help me? Or was he somehow part of whatever haunted the cemetery? That night, I packed a bag and checked into a motel on the other side of town. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. As I lay in the uncomfortable motel bed, I found myself drifting off despite my anxiety. A soft knocking woke me. 3:17 a.m. according to the digital clock on the nightstand. The knocking came again, gentle but persistent.
I found you. Did you think you could hide from me?
The voice was right outside my motel room door. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe.
Open the door. I'm so tired of being alone. Don't you want to see my face? Don't you want to know what happened to the others?
I remained frozen in bed, not daring to move or speak.
The old man can't help you. He tried to help the others too, but in the end they all came with me, just like you will.
There was a pause, and then a different voice spoke. A voice I recognized.
Don't listen to it, son. Stay strong. Morning is coming.
It was the security guard's voice, but something was wrong with it. It sounded strained, as if he was speaking through great pain.
He's mine now. They're all mine, and soon you will be too.
The voices fell silent. I lay awake until dawn, too terrified to move. When the sun rose, I checked out of the motel and drove to the public library. I spent hours researching the cemetery's history, looking for any mention of the crying child or the disappearances. In a collection of local newspapers from the 1970s, I found what I was looking for. A small article about a night watchman at the cemetery who had gone missing. The article included a photo, and I felt sick as I recognized the old man who had warned me away from the girl. According to the article, Harold Jenkins had worked at the cemetery for 23 years before his disappearance. The only clue was a report from a local resident who claimed to have heard a child crying in the cemetery the night Jenkins vanished. I drove back to my house, knowing I couldn't stay there, but needing to collect more of my belongings. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something on my front porch. A security guard's hat, weathered and faded with age. I approached it cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at me. There was a piece of paper tucked into the hatband. I unfolded it with trembling hands. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone elderly or in distress. It won't stop until it takes you. I've held it off as long as I can. I'm sorry. Run far away from here and never return. And remember, never approach a crying child near a graveyard. I packed my car with everything I could fit and drove away that afternoon. I've been moving from place to place ever since, never staying anywhere for more than a few weeks. But no matter how far I go, I always wake up at exactly 3:17 a.m. to the sound of soft knocking at my door. And sometimes, just before dawn, I hear the old security guard's voice warning others away from me. Because I think the thing from the cemetery is using me now, using me to find new victims. I try to fight it, but its hold grows stronger every day. So if you ever hear a child crying near a graveyard, walk the other way. And if someone knocks on your door at 3:17 a.m., whatever you do, don't answer. It might be me on the other side, but I won't be alone.